Hi, it's 10:45, so we're going to go ahead and get started. This is the Meeting Community Needs with Archival Collections presentation, so if that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. We're your presenters today, so I'm Ashley Mugley. I'm the Assistant Collections Manager of the Anthropology Collections at the CU Museum of Natural History. My co-presenter today is Will Gregg. He's our archivist at the Anthropology Collections of CU Museum. And so our presentation today is going to go over kind of the how-to of processing archival collections, as well as just kind of like how processing our collections has improved our ability to really help our external researchers and internal work in the museum. And we're going to have like a tiny little brief section that goes over sort of the importance of this work when it comes to NAGPRA, just because that's a really integral part of our work. And so hopefully this is informative for you guys. So the agenda for today, we'll go over briefly kind of the history of the CU Museum of Natural History, kind of the challenges we faced as a collection working with unprocessed archives. Will Gregg will go over kind of the how-to of processing collections so that you can kind of do this work in your own museum. And then we'll talk about relational databases and finding aids and how they're really important. And then the audiences and communities that we specifically work with at our museum, and then how this has improved NAGPRA work for ourselves, and then just the overall benefits of processed collections. So the CU Museum was founded in 1909, with the first anthropology collections actually being excavated in 1912 by Earl H. Morris. So the museum was originally located in the Hale building of the the Hale building on campus, which is now the anthropology department building. So until 1937. So this is when construction of a new museum was actually completed. So the Henderson building, as it is known today, has been the museum's primary home ever since. So the museum as a whole has 4 million plus collections from several different disciplines, not just anthropology. So we also have zoology, paleontology, and herbarium specimens. So the anthropology collections themselves are home to over 1.5 million archaeological, ethnographic, and historic collections. And so over the course of its more than 100-year history, the museum has also collected and generated a large archival collection. So to provide some personal background information, I've been working with the CU Museum of Natural History in the anthropology department for nearly 6 years now. So I started as a volunteer, later becoming a collections assistant, then a graduate student of the Museum and Field Studies program, and then moved into my new position as the Anthropology Assistant Collections Manager. So during my time working at the museum, I've been fortunate enough to see how our archives were used and accessed prior to Will Gregg becoming our archivist. I've also used the archives for several different projects, whether they were work projects or class research projects. So having been both a staff member and a researcher, I've been able to see the benefits of processed collections on both sides of the equation. So the photo to the left is what our archive storage looked like in 2018 prior to Will being hired. As you can likely tell from the photo, there isn't a lot of structure to how things are organized, and not everything has labels on it. So you can see in those boxes that it's really hard to tell what's going on. And so collections were often split within the archives room. So while there may be a box on one of the shelves pictured, we also had additional material relating to the same collection and file cabinets to the right, and binders were hidden on a shelf towards like the corner of the room in like the way back. And so archives also weren't only split within the archives room itself. Often additional material could be found in the workroom, the collections manager's office, in permanent collection storage rooms. So things were really spread out without logical groupings, and we didn't always have a clear idea of what material could be found where. So it was really institutional knowledge that wasn't written down, that you kind of had to learn and memorize while working there, or ask staff members repeatedly on where maybe some of this information could be located. So because our archival collections were not housed by archival best practices or even all housed within the same vicinity, information would often get missed by staff or collections assistants. And so this lack of intellectual and physical control kind of made object research difficult for us as staff, but also meant that outside researcher requests demanded a considerable amount of time to kind of fulfill and look into. And in museums, there always is kind of this never-ending list of tasks that need to be completed. And we simply did not have the time or resources to really pull all archival materials related to a researcher's request every single time one came in. We did the best that we could, but trying our hardest to make sure we could fulfill them, but we knew that our archives could really use help so we could gain intellectual control and better respond to our community's needs in a shorter period of time. So fortunately, we were able to hire trained archivists so we could implement archival best practices into these collections. So before we jump into the how-to of processing collections, we wanted to kind of clarify what our section and institution considers part of our archival collections, so we can all be kind of like on the same page while we're going through this. So it's possible that you might include other materials into yours, and that's totally fine. We just wanted to provide an idea of what is considered working museum documentation or more like administrative files and what is part of the archives. So we don't create records for our museum documentation. These are things that we still process and make accessible for our use, but they aren't something that we share in the same way we do our archives. So things like accession and deaccession files, as well as like loan files, kind of tend to stay within the collections manager's office. We have a system of filing them so they're easy to access, but we don't process them to make them accessible for researchers on like a finding aid or in the database. Which is the same for our ledgers and catalog cards. We access these for projects all the time, but we don't process these and create records in our database or put them on finding aids. So these are the important documents for our work, but they aren't something that we necessarily find appropriate to put down in storage the way that we do other documents. So things that we do consider part of our archives are things like photos, for example. So the following examples all come from our Earl Morris archives, which have already been processed and made available online. So Will and Collections Assistants also created social media outreach with these materials to engage with a wide audience on the importance of these collections. So as you can see, we have glass plate negatives, glass lantern slides, photo prints, as well as cellulose negatives and other types of photos. These photos might relate to excavation seasons, they might be of field sites, or even personal photos from collectors. These are things that need to be processed, housed, and kept track of for our own internal use and for research requests. We also have maps. So some of these are small drawings used in publications, and some are really large drawings created in the field to map out an entire area and locate specific sites. So these are incredibly useful and important for us to process and, take better care of them so that we can preserve them. We also have field notes. These are usually notebooks or binders filled with excavator and collector notes for each day. So these often contain the exact context from which objects were collected and can be incredibly useful for identifying who owns the material, whether it might fall under federal or state laws, and other important information. So these primary documents can be some of the most important to reference while doing collections work, so we made sure to process these and make them more accessible. So this could also include scanning documents, so we don't have to handle them as much, helping to preserve them for a longer period of time. Like I mentioned earlier, our earliest anthropology collections came in 1912. So we want to make sure we are caring for these documents and ensuring that they're preserved. And we also have more general excavation materials. So these might be specific site diagrams or even object catalogs that were put together by collectors. And finally, we have personal correspondences. So these are things that might be really important to keep because we might have letters detailing exchanges or loans of material that the museum doesn't have formal documentation for. So processing and getting a better sense of what and who collectors were corresponding with can help track down where missing material might have gone. Plus, you might also find some just genuinely fun documents. So we found like a letter in our collection from A.V. Kidder to Earl Morse's family where he drew a bunch of images that we had to kind of decode to read. So these tend to be really great for use in social media posts or other public programs. And so these personal documents especially can also give insight into the collection's biases that went into the creation of the collections in our care. This is something that our graduate students and collections assistants, Elizabeth and Natalie, were able to address and touch on during their session yesterday. And so now that I've kind of given some context to our collections, I'll let Will Gregg walk you through the process so you can learn some tips and tricks to getting started with your archival materials.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, so as Ashley said, the goal is to, go from that picture we had of the shelf with just random assortments of unlabeled boxes on it to an archival collection you can actually kind of use. And so I'm going to talk about what steps we go through to process our archival collections here at CUMNH, and maybe there's some techniques that you could apply if you're looking at working with your own collections. So just to start off that discussion, I kind of wanted to go over some differences between collections and archives and museums. So Ashley already showed us what kinds of materials we include in our archives, but besides material type, I think the biggest difference between archive collections and museum collections is probably that in the museum world, ideally we have a lot of control over each item, information about its provenience and cultural association and physical integrity. Whereas in archives, we kind of tend to manage items in groups just because there's so many of them. Archival collections can be made up of 20 items. They can be really small, but more commonly there are 20,000 or so items or even more, pieces of paper, individual photographs, things like that. And so we tend to deal with archival collections in the aggregate and not spend as much time on each individual object. Examples of archival collections in our museum include kind of the personal papers of a former curator, the records of an archaeological field school, and the papers and photographs of individual archaeologists, just to give you a sense about what we're talking about. I think that in our museum and also in other repositories, it's important to point out that while the archival and museum collections are different in scope, there's a really strong relationship between the two. They can inform each other, they can provide context for one another, and as the case with our collections, sometimes there can be dozens of pages of field notes, multiple photographs, and a few letters of correspondence associated with one item in our museum collection. And for that reason, I'd like to suggest that getting a handle on archival collections can be really important for understanding your museum objects. So I will dive into how we do archival processing in general here at CUMNH. But to start out, here are some basic concepts. These are three really key concepts in archives. So the first is the notion of the archival creator. That's the person, family, or organization who's responsible for bringing the materials together. So when we talk about archival creators, it's not the person who literally made the materials, although that can be the case. It's the person who caused the materials to be brought together. So Ashley was talking about the Earl Morris collection. In that collection, there are a lot of things written and photographed by other people other than Earl Morris, but that stuff ended up in Earl Morris's desk or office at one point, and so he's the creator because he brought all that material together. So there's also the principle of provenance, and that's the notion that all the records with a common creator in archives should be kept together. And if you dive deep into the archival literature after this presentation, which of course I hope you do, you might also encounter that concept called by the name respectifond. So the last concept is original order, and that's the notion that the original order is the arrangement the archival materials had when they were transferred from the creator to the institution where they're currently held. So original order generally in archives is preserved to the degree that is practical. So a really common instance of this is like if someone alphabetized their letters, then you would generally want to keep that organizational scheme. So these three definitions together allow us to understand what makes up an archival collection and how collections are separated from one another. And the main point to stress is that collections are made up of materials with a common creator. So if you're looking to process collections in your archives, you need to first identify who your archival creators are. Okay, so how do you do actual processing? Well, there are kind of two big picture steps. The first is to identify what collections you have in your archives. You know, where does one collection end and where does another collection begin? And the way to do that is kind of through identifying who the creator is. And remember, that can be a person or an organization or a group of people. And then if you want to do processing, you also have to prioritize which collections you want to work with first, which is something that we've been doing here at CWAM. So steps for processing an individual collection once you've selected one to work with are to create an inventory, write a processing plan, arrange and rehouse that collection, and then publish information about that collection through some means, whether that be a finding aid or a database or both or some other means. Okay, so let's talk more about identifying discrete collections. So after you've isolated collections from one another, it becomes easier to choose one collection for processing or a mix or make a list of collections in order of priority. And here are some considerations we can keep in mind when doing that. So again, materials in a collection share a common creator, and they have a common institutional home. So you might have a collection of half of the papers of some individual at your museum, and another institution might have the other half. Those are still two separate collections. And then collections don't necessarily share the same shelf location or even the same room in your building. As Ashley mentioned, our archival materials were spread all around our building, and part of processing is kind of uniting those and bringing them into the same place. Also, archival collections don't need to have a single accession or a single time that they were brought in. It could be multiple instances of that. And then again, collections don't necessarily have to share an author because the author is different from a creator. Okay, so once you've isolated collections, how do you prioritize them? I think there are three main considerations we can talk about. The first is kind of time. You know, how much time do you have to spend processing a collection? And if you know a collection is really messy, if it's big and it has poor original order or organization, that's going to require more effort. Also, the research value is really important. Think about who might be using this collection when it comes to your internal audiences, the staff and other people in your museum, and also external audiences, you know, researchers coming in from the outside. And then also research value can kind of hinge on if there are upcoming events associated with a collection, you know, kind of a time-sensitive reason you want to access these materials. And then also preservation status is an important thing to consider. So collections that are stored in ways that are doing damage to them generally ought to be processed before ones that can sit for longer without accruing damage. And what to look for with that is materials that kind of degrade quickly, like newspapers when they're stored improperly, and also materials with a lot of inherent vice, such as nitrate negatives and other film types. Okay, so you've identified a collection you want to work with in your museum. What we did here at CUMNH as a first step, and what you would do, generally is to inventory a collection and kind of get a grasp on exactly what is in the collection and where is it. So things that I like to put in our collection inventories include the name of the collection, obviously, the location of the materials. So, what shelves are they on, what rooms, what filing cabinets, etc. Any titles that already exist on the boxes and folders and containers that house the materials. Also, narrative descriptions of the materials in these containers. So, just kind of a brief description of what do you see when you open it. And then, as is the case at our museum, there's a lot of pre-existing inventories. So it might be the case that one collection has been inventoried, 4 or 5 different times over the course of your the history of your institution. And so it's kind of nice to bring those all together and make sure you're not missing any of the work that people have done before you. And then I also really like to include pictures in collection inventory. It helps people understand what was going on once you've processed the collection and all this stuff is moved. Okay, so we've written an inventory. Now the next step is to write a processing plan. So when we talk about archival processing, the general definition from the Society of the American Archivists is preparing archival materials for use. So the first step in kind of doing that preparation is planning out what's going to happen in processing. And a processing plan is a document that helps us understand what we need to do to get the collection into good shape and how long it will take. And it also documents our decisions in a structured way so that our colleagues and our predecessors can understand what we did and why. Processing plans are really ubiquitous online, and we've included several plans by way of example in the resources sheet that I think we have linked below. There's a drive link at the bottom of the session screen that you can click on, and there's some example processing plans in there in case you're looking to get some ideas there. But here are some of the basic elements you'll find in most plans, whether you're using a pre-made template or not. The size and current organization is really important to capture. How big is the collection and how is it ordered? The provenance, where did it come from? Who is the creator? And any official accession records you have that are associated with it. A biographical historical narrative. So what's the history of the person who created these materials or the organization who created the materials? A proposed arrangement is really important. So the materials are a certain way now. How do you want them to be? And the proposed arrangement is where you work that out. And we'll talk a lot about that in a second. Then also a plan of work. Who's going to do what and how long is it going to take? Any supplies you might need and any special preservation concerns. So in a processing plan, I always like to note non-textual materials because those require special care, like photographic media, any CDs, floppy disks, thumb drives, stuff like that. Okay, I'd like to focus in on one element of the processing plan, which is arrangement, because that's a really crucial part of what we do in archives. Earlier, I talked about how archival collections typically include far too much material to document each item individually. So if that's the case, then how do we stay organized and find what we're looking for? The answer to that is a hierarchical arrangement, which is a technique where we divide collections into increasingly narrower areas. There's several levels in the archival hierarchy, and these are the most commonly used that you see before you. You can note that a collection does not have to have any series files or items, as is often the case with small collections. But a collection needs to have at least the collection level, and the other levels are just useful to have, especially with larger collections. Generally, it is helpful to have some series, and in larger collections, it's common to have 5 or more series, perhaps, and even hundreds of different files. Processing an archival collection to the item level is rare, except in cases where the collection is being prepped for digitization, and in that instance, it becomes very valuable. As an example, let's take a look at the Acme Company papers. So you can see here that there are 3 series in the Acme Company papers, and that the series are processed to different levels to suit our needs. The series files and items are numbered, which makes it easier to keep track of our materials. So the first series is Gadget Blueprints, and within that we have 2 files. We have Exploding Objects and Illusions. And this series is processed down to the item level, perhaps because we expected these items to be used a lot, or we might be digitizing them. And the items are, of course, the Boom Boom trampoline, the portable hole, and the railway tunnel. The second series is blooper reels. We processed those to just the file level, and in those files we have the Fast and the Furious and Scrambled Eggs, and then finally we have the third series, which is the Wile E. Coyote fan letters. We didn't process this to the file or item level, maybe because we don't anticipate as much research use with this. Most researchers into using the Acme Company records are very serious researchers, and so they generally don't care as much about the fan letters. Okay, so let's go from kind of an abstract example of an arrangement to one that we actually used here at our museum. This is part of the arrangement I came up with for the Earl Morris papers last year. And this arrangement is meant to make it easy to find field notes for a particular area or site. So on this slide, you can see part of the arrangement of Series 2 of the collection, which contains the archaeological field notes. So in this series, I've used a hierarchical arrangement to divide the materials into geographical areas. And so if you're looking for documents about a particular item in your museum, say a bowl, you can then browse through the notes pertaining to the area where that bowl originates and hopefully find what you're looking for. It helps that the Earl Morris papers were already organized in this manner to some degree, but no matter how your archival materials are currently situated, you have some latitude in processing, and I would encourage you to think about how your materials can be best arranged to suit the research needs and cases that are most likely to arise. Okay, so rearranging and rehousing a collection is all about taking what you've written in the processing plan and applying it. File folders, photographs, journals, diplomas, articles, all that stuff will go into archival grade storage in the order that you've laid out in your hierarchical arrangement. Each folder or container needs to be labeled so that its title, container number, and place in the hierarchy is evident. This is just an example on this slide of materials that were rehoused as part of that Earl Morris processing project. And this is another view of the collection after rehousing. You can see that all the boxes have uniform labels, and then also all the folders have uniform labels, and those labels come in 3 parts, and on the next slide we'll talk a little bit about what those parts are. So this is just an example of what you can include on your archival folders. It's what I like to do. You might want to do something different. The identifier is particularly important as it signifies the place the object falls within the greater collection hierarchy. So let's go ahead and see concrete examples of what those labels might look like. So for the title, this is a piece of correspondence. So the title is Gray Irving. That means it's correspondence coming from Irving Gray, and it gives us the dates as well. And it's box 6, folder 7, so the 7th folder in box 6. And then the identifier is EHM01_041. That identifier indicates that this is the 41st file in the first series of the Earl Morris collection. So EHM01 indicates series 1, 041 indicates file 41. And that's just a nice shorthand that helps you find what you're looking for. And if you're using a database to describe your archival materials, having an identifier system like this can be really helpful. Okay, once you've done the hard work of implementing an arrangement and getting your collection research ready, it's time to publish a guide for your internal users and ideally also your external users. This is a crucial step since a well-processed collection isn't actually accessible unless there's a way for users to kind of take it all in and find what they're looking for. And there are a couple ways to do this depending on the time and technology available to you. So the simplest way to do it is just a Word doc or a PDF finding aid that you can store on site. You could put it in your shared network drives, or you could just throw it up on your website. And as with the processing plan that we discussed earlier, there are a number of finding aid templates and guidelines online that you can compare and contrast if you're going to go that Word document or PDF route. And some of those examples are linked in the resources page as well that we've included. On the other end of the spectrum, there are dedicated finding aid programs like ArchivesSpace, which is an open source information management software for archives. And they have features like an expandable menu that shows your hierarchical arrangement. Expandable menus aren't unique to ArchiveSpace, of course, and a well-designed web page or PDF might accomplish something similar. But if you're embarking on, a years-long processing endeavor in your archives, it might be nice to check out some dedicated finding aid tools like ArchiveSpace. And I just wanted to point out that these are two versions of the same finding aid. So the Earl Morris papers we have on ArchiveSpace on the left, and then on the right, that's what it looks like just as a PDF document. Okay, regardless of what you use to produce your finding aid, it's important that it has certain elements, and these elements are what make a finding aid valuable as a research guide. The elements below are based on standards laid out by the Society of American Archivists, and there's plenty more and detailed information available about what to include in your finding aid that you can find in our resources document. So I would say that when you're making a finding aid, the information you have to have is the name of the creator, the name of the collection, the language or languages that the collection is in, the name of your institution, and then the relationship of your hierarchical levels. So how many series are there? What are they called? And same for files and items. That's the kind of information you would list at the top level, kind of the first information you see on your finding aid. And then for each of the series and files and items in your collection, you'd repeat this information in the middle column. So you would have titles, dates, the extent or size of the unit, the scope and content, which is basically just a summary of what's in the unit you're talking about, and then any restrictions associated with the material. So you'd repeat all of those for each series, file, and item. And then bonus information that you can include at the beginning of your finding aid, again at that top level, is a historical note about the creator of the collection, maybe some procedures for researchers and how they might access the material if they're looking to do that, external researchers, I mean. Processing history, so what steps did you take to process it? When did that happen? Who did it? A finding aid author and processor is really good to have because we want to make sure that we get credit for our work, right? And then finally, permissions and copyright that come with using the material.
So now that Will has walked you through the importance of finding aids, I'd also like to cover the importance of relational databases. So relational databases organize data into tables that can be linked or related based on fields common to each other. So being able to create relationships between various records and fields can help us as museum staff gain further intellectual control over our collections and gain new insights into what is in our care, improve project decisions, and identify future work that needs to be done. So the identifiers found in the database are often going to be the same identifiers found in the finding aid. So these two resources are useful to have on hand and they really speak to one another. At the CU Museum, we use Rediscovery Proficio for our museum, library, and archive collections. So one of the nice features of our database is that we have an associations table that allows us to link object records, archive records, and library records together. So we're still kind of working through the process of creating and finalizing associations, but knowing that we have the ability to connect these collections has improved our ability to understand which collections have, really robust amount of information related to them and which might simply lack information. And being able to know that simply when looking at an object record can greatly improve our understanding of our collections overall. We're also able to put flags on archival documents. So maybe if we need to add restrictions. So restrictions might be placed for handling purposes if something is really fragile, or maybe we have cultural restrictions, in which case we might need permission from the originating community before we share certain information with researchers. So having all this information in the database has improved our ability to anticipate restrictions during requests and also find related material that we might not have been able to easily identify beforehand. So all of this really goes a long way in meeting the needs of our diverse communities. So speaking of our communities, here's an overview of some of the audiences we have identified for our museum. So being a university museum, we have quite a wide range of communities we receive requests from, and each will have their own objectives, timelines, and resources that they need. Our ability to respond to requests and the needs of these communities has greatly increased thanks to processing our archival collections. Even simply making the finding aids available online can go a long way in making responding to requests easier and faster, especially since external researchers can make more specific requests based on those documents. So one of the primary audiences for our museum overall is actually families with young children. So we have education kit programs that make collections accessible to schools, and they get used in just like programming. So some of these kits have archival information in them, not necessarily original documents, but they contain information related to the objects in the kit. Overall, we don't personally get requests for information from families and K through 12 aged students, but every now and then we might have something that could be really useful to share during an educational program. And our education staff, like external researchers, can make requests for materials or copies of materials now that we have finding aids. We also work with students and professors on campus. So often it's primarily our curators who make requests for their own personal classes, but we do sometimes get requests from other departments. As our archival collections continue to improve and our finding aids become more accessible online, we imagine our ability to accommodate students and professors who want to conduct research projects will continue to grow. Being a university museum, we're a great resource on campus for students who want to really dip their toes into formal museum research and get experience working with museum staff. So we can provide training on how to handle archival materials, how to conduct oneself as a researcher at a museum, and other useful skills. Overall, we're able to accommodate students better now that our material is being processed. Plus, it's just really great fun, to work with students on campus who have never been part of behind the scenes of a museum and really get to see them interact with, primary documents that maybe they've never got to experience before. And we're also a state and federal repository. So we have a really large cultural resource management collection, as well as several federal collections. As such, we work closely with state and federal agencies to care for their collections, and that includes caring for archival documents that were created during archaeological excavations or other acquisitions. So when these agencies are conducting research or audits of their collections, they may need access to our archives, and so processing these documents has improved the work for all responsible parties. We also get requests from historians, anthropologists, and archaeologists, so external researchers not connected to the university. When we've gotten requests, they sometimes want information related more to the people who were involved with the excavations or collections rather than the permanent collections themselves. Luckily, by processing our archives, we've been able to kind of distinguish between archaeological and collection materials versus these personal papers that are more related to the collectors themselves. So we've been able to understand how to organize material to better suit the needs of the requester, as well as what we anticipate they'll be interested in. We've been doing a lot of work to understand and anticipate what materials each audience may request and trying to structure things in a way that makes sense to ease access to collections. And finally, we work with descendant and originating communities in consultation and in collaboration to improve our care and understanding of collections or through repatriation materials. So we've gotten requests from individuals whose family members have donated objects, for example, who want to see analysis or documents relating to the collections or correspondences between artists and the museum. And we also work on repatriation requests under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, as I've mentioned several times, which I'll be discussing further. So one of the most direct ways we work with descendants and originating communities based in the US is through NAGPRA. So this federal law allows for Native American tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations to make requests for repatriation of ancestors, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. So for our work at the museum, even simply the ability to identify funerary objects in our collections has greatly improved with processed archives. Like I stated at the beginning, we simply didn't know where to find all the archival materials related to every excavation, and a lot of times information simply got missed. Because these were kind of just tied to institutional knowledge, it got lost when people retired or moved on from the museum. So thanks to Will's hard work, we've been able to track down burial context information and are better able to update inventories and summaries accordingly, and ensuring that we're not only staying in compliance, but also able to follow the spirit of the law and ensure that we can provide better information to tribes to be transparent about the objects in our care and their history. So the graph above kind of provides context to one of our sites and whether burial context was present in each of the various museum documents and archives. So if we didn't know where to find the Morris Field Report or the Catalog of Objects or the Carlson Field Report, these are documents that are found within our archival collections, and relied entirely on the database, catalog, cards, or ledgers, funerary information would have been missed, which means we wouldn't have had accurate information in our inventories or summaries to send to National NAGPRA or to tribes. You can also see from the graph that there are varying differences in numbers for what has burial context depending on the document you use. So having access to all of the documents in combination can really help inform us of inconsistencies or conflicting information, and even evaluate which documentation might consistently miss information. So this would kind of make it less reliable overall across all of the collections. We also are grateful that our most used archives were processed prior to the pandemic. So we've been working with federal agencies to conduct NAGPRA inventories on their collections, and a fear we had when we were sent home during the initial quarantine period and not knowing how long we wouldn't be allowed back for was losing the momentum we had made on our NAGPRA projects. So thankfully, because a lot of the archives had actually been scanned and digitized and were available through our database and shared drives, we were actually able to continue to identify NAGPRA objects in our collections, and we really didn't lose that momentum. So the ability to work and research remotely meant that we can have dedicated time during this hybrid period to really focus on in-person time entirely to collections care, such as maybe mount making, inventorying, collection storage, and other tasks. And our at-home time could be dedicated to research and data entry. I also wanted to mention that there is a section within the law that actually states institutions and agencies are required to make documents available upon request to tribes and organizations. So this means that archival documents relating to requests might need to be shared so that tribes can make their cultural affiliation claims. So making these documents accessible for tribes is easiest when the archives are already processed rather than processing materials for each request that you get. And the reason we decided to really include this section, other than simply showing an improved commitment to making these things accessible, is that due to the pandemic, many institutions that did not receive federal funding prior might have been given federal funds within the last year to help their institutions. So if this is the first time your museum has received federal funding and you happen to have Native American or Native Hawaiian collections, you'll need to comply with NAGPRA. So we wanted to just kind of briefly touch upon the improvements archival rehousing has had on our process, because it might be something that could really help you as well. And then overall, just working with process collections has improved our ability to conduct our work. So simply having storage locations available in the database has made finding material easier, even when material is still spread across multiple rooms, and we know that important documents won't get missed like they were prior. So we've really gained intellectual control over our very important collections, and this makes it easier for us to respond to inquiries and research requests. So overall, the benefits we've gained and the improvements we've been able to make to accommodate the needs of our communities is tremendous. And we're so grateful to have been able to learn how to approach our archival collections from a trained archivist. Hopefully you all have also learned some important skills to help tackle your own archives and make them more accessible to your staff and your communities. Thank you. And then if anyone has any questions, we wanted to just leave a lot of time for discussion with everyone here today. Or, if you want to share if you're working on your archives or not, that would be great as well. We'd love to hear from you guys. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hey. So am I muted? No, okay. I've been doing some advising to a very small church archive, and I'm just kind of figuring out what sort of other resources there might be out there for them in terms of something CIRMA might have, or just who I could direct them to get more help. No idea.
Having trouble with my mute button there. Sorry, Rebecca. Say again. So it's what exactly is the kind of collection and the
it's a small church archive in the Denver area, and they've got basically documents, photos, educational materials, all going back to their origins in the late 19th century. So it's the usual small organization mixed bag. They got a small space. Unfortunately, it is a space that the ceiling's lined with HVAC pipes, which of course is terrifying. But I'm just trying to figure out. They have a little bit of money. I was telling them they should try to get something like Past Perfect, but there may be, you guys were talking about some archival database materials. But what do CIRMA or other groups offer that I could send their way in terms of more advice?
Yeah, that's it sounds like they have a really cool collection and definitely worthwhile working with. Yeah, I think that, there's a lot to think about there because there's, like you said, there's the preservation aspect and then there's also the processing. I think that when it comes to resources from CIRMA or other groups, a great way to start might just be to post on listservs with specific questions about the material. I know that I don't think that I might be wrong, and someone can correct me if they know better. I don't think that CIRMA offers financial assistance for processing projects or preservation, but they would definitely know, what grants or other resources might be available. And the Preservation Assistance Grant is from the National Endowment for the Humanities, is a great small grant to help with preservation. I'll just mention that because
Okay.
it's on the top of my head. But there are many, many more. And I think that the Society of American Archivists maintains a list of granting opportunities. So I will try to find that and put that in the chat. And Christy has just put in the chat the Preservation Assistance Grant. So if they're looking for financial assistance, that might be a really good one to shoot for, because it's geared towards smaller institutions who want to embark on preservation projects. And as far as the processing bit goes and the database and such, I guess my recommendation would be not to let finding the perfect database get in the way of doing the work. So if it's something where they have limited staff and limited time to do training, sometimes that solution of just finding or just using Word documents for finding aids and getting kind of an inventory of your collections in a spreadsheet can be a really great first step. And then if you get that data written down, you can always migrate it later. You can copy it into a database. But I have not personally used Past Perfect. But I mean, it sounds like it would be a great solution if they want to go that route eventually. Archive Space, I will warn, is a little bit, it's not super user-friendly right off the bat, and there's a lot of jargon. So there's a bunch of resources to help with implementing it, but I know that it is a bit jargony.
Yeah. Well, they were talking about maybe doing something in Access just to begin with. I've used Excel with very small archives in the past. But in fact, I was running a hospital archive for a while and I did that. I noticed that Robert up in Gillette had a similar question to what I was asking with how can you be time efficient in processing?
Yeah.
That's a good one too, especially if you got a lot of volunteers working.
Yeah, that's a super good question. I guess we should go ahead. Maybe I'll just go ahead and read Robert's question, and we can jump to talking about that. So Robert's asking what advice we might have for small museums that don't have dedicated archivists, but they have archival collections they want to work with, and like what's a time efficient way to process that material and not get too bogged down in the details. So yeah, I think that when I'm working with archival collections, there's always more I could do. To Robert's point, archival processing is kind of a never-ending endeavor, and you can always get more and more detailed. So I love the fact that you mentioned the box level finding aid or inventory, Robert. That's something that instead of coming up with an arrangement for your collections where you say, series 1 is going to be correspondence, series 2 is going to be photographs, things like that. But sometimes you can just go through and see what boxes belong in the collection and list the materials in those boxes and give the boxes numbers. So that's not ideal, because ideally you do want an intellectual arrangement, but it is a super time efficient way to get a handle of your collections. And if you're just embarking on a processing project where you have a bunch of stuff, a bunch of different collections that you need to take care of, I would say doing just a box inventory for all of the stuff in your archives is the way to go. I think getting that basic control over all the collections is great. And then that gives you a better idea of what's the scope of these collections and what do we want to work on in more detail.
What about finding aids?
Yeah. Finding aids, I think, are kind of the next step once you've done a little bit of processing. If you are okay with people coming in and using your materials and you don't have concerns about permissions and restrictions, then sometimes you can just publish a box and folder list and say, here's what we have. get in touch with us if you're interested in doing some research. Where that gets problematic is that maybe there's something in a box in one of your collections that you don't want to make publicly available for whatever reason. And without processing the collection, there's no way to know what that material might be, right? So if you're worried about that potentially being an issue, I would say do some level of processing, get a better idea of what material's in the collection before you publish a finding aid. But if you're not concerned about that, then go ahead and put that box folder list or really basic description out online and invite people to take a look.
If you did a survey of potential users, could that guide your objectives in your processing?
Definitely, yeah. I think that would be awesome. Yeah, if you if you have a means of understanding who's going to use the collections, that would be great. And sometimes you do get really surprised by who comes in, so it can be really good to know that, and it would guide your processing technique. Like I was talking about with Earl Morris, I kind of expected a lot of use from our internal staff who were trying to better understand our museum collections. So I had them in mind when I was doing my processing. But if I had thought that our main users were going to be historians of the Four Corners area in the first half of the 20th century, I might have come up with a very different arrangement. So it does influence how I think about things, at least.
I think I'm going to get off your screen.
Thanks for all your questions, and good luck. Feel free to reach out. I'll put my email in the chat. And if you have any further questions, feel free to get in touch.
By the way, you guys have great handouts for this session.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I hope they're useful. I think someone was asking too where they were located, and if you haven't found them yet, if you scroll down past the presenter screen to the bottom of the session page, there's a link down there to a Google Drive folder. Let me know if you have further trouble.
I also posted it in the chat, so if people want to look at that.
Excellent. Let's see, just making sure I'm not missing anything. I think to Karen's question in the Q&A, I think that everything's going on YouTube, is my understanding. If you want to look for the presentation later. And I think that's just being published by the CWAM on the CWAM organization page.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm totally fine staying here the whole time if you guys want to ask questions at any point, but that was kind of our presentation. So if you want to head out, that's totally fine. And it was great to see you all here today and joining us. So hope you have a good weekend.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming, and I'll also stick around a couple minutes just in case. Ashley, I like your graph on the improvement for NAGPRA work page. I didn't realize you were keeping track of that.
Yeah, let's see. This one?
Yeah, that one. That's super cool to see.
Yeah, that was part of my master's project. So because I was identifying unassociated funerary objects in the collection, it was helpful for me to really identify where those inconsistencies were happening so I could evaluate what to take as maybe being the most accurate information. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So, yeah, kind of an eye-opening thing to see what gets captured and what might get lost if you don't have every bit of information.
Yeah, I mean, losing just one of those would be pretty catastrophic.
And I'll just leave this up here in case anyone wants our contact information.
I just put the link to the SAA granting opportunities list in case anyone wants to look at that. It's pretty exhausting because there's just a lot on there, but it's definitely a good place to start.
Do you have that listed in our resource document?
I don't think I do. I'll go ahead and drop it in there.
Thank you.